Today, I want to talk about how to think like a leader at home. I'm talking to pastors, missionaries, campus missionaries, church planters, spiritual leaders in the church, even if you're not employed by the church or the ministry. But how do we take our spiritual leadership, not just leave it at our ministry context, but bring that home? So especially if you're a married man or woman, how do we lead at home? How do we think right at home? We know how to think like a leader in a lot of contexts, in a ministry context, in a ministry world, in a church world. But what happens at home? So those of you who are, you're not married, you're not a husband or a wife, and you don't have kids, maybe someday you will. I hope I can help you think right. And if you aren't, if you're not called to be married and you're a leader, I hope that the principle of how to think outside of a ministry moment is applied to all of life. And I was reading, I pulled my journal out this morning and I was flipping back a few pages of what I read. A week ago, I was in Indonesia and I was at a Build conference, an Every Nation Build conference with about 150 leaders from Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Singapore, and we had a few guests from China and a couple of other Asian nations. And I was rolling back to what I wrote in my journal a couple of days ago, and just before I walked into this studio to shoot this video, and it was, I was reading First Chronicles, but particularly what I got stuck on that day was chapter 16, verse 43. It says this: "Then all the people departed, each to his house, and David went home to bless his household." David went home to bless his household. And I want to just read what I wrote in my journal that day. "After a significant day of spiritual leadership, bringing the ark to the tent," and to get a little background, you can go back and read a few chapters and see all of the stuff that was going on. Some of the most significant leadership David had to apply as a spiritual leader, as a government leader, as a military leader. All of the leadership roles David had, a lot of weight and a lot of significant things happening. So after a significant day of spiritual leadership, bringing the ark to the tent, leading the people, public ministry, public leadership, David came home. Not angry, not drained, not grumpy, not exhausted, but the scripture says he went home to bless his household. And I was meditating on that. I was praying that. I was repenting that. I was doing what I do when I read scripture, and it applies really perfectly to my situation. Do I go home as a blessing, or do I go home completely zapped and drained and really with less than a spiritual leader when I get where I'm going, once I leave the office or the ministry context? And I thought about a phrase that I heard from my dear friend and colleague, Kevin York. And this is a number of years ago. We were talking about consistency as spiritual leaders and how easy it is to display or manifest or pretend like we live in the fruit of the Spirit from the pulpit, or when we are going from our car to church and walking through the lobby and meeting people and greeting people. And it's so natural to look like we have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, the fruit of the Spirit all over the place in the church lobby and at the front of the church, before the service, after the service, and then while we're in what we think of as a ministry context, and then to go home and be less than having peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. And I wrote down the quote from Kevin, and I ran this by him earlier today. I said, "Kevin, this is how I remember you saying it. Was it accurate?" And I put in my journal, this is my prayer journal, a Kevin York quote: "I decided early in ministry that if anyone deserved to experience the fruit of the Spirit from my life, it was my wife and kids." And then Kevin elaborated on that. I said, "Kevin, am I quoting you properly here?" He said, "Yeah, here's the context." And he talked about how, he said, you guys know Kevin, he's got a lot of energy for relational connection. And he said, "Steve, it was just my personality. I could go around and be kind to people and be nice to people and all this is just how I am. And then I would go home and be the opposite." And he said, "I got convicted. I would go home to the weight of personal finances, to the weight of marriage, disagreements and the weight of teenage kids and all the things. And he said, then I realized that I left all semblance of the fruit of the Spirit at the church office. And it was a turning point. And we talked about that deeply, of who deserves to experience the fruit of the Spirit from our lives. And I think everybody does. I think everybody we encounter, but especially those that we're doing that are close, tight family. And then I think even also those we work closest with. And sometimes with family and sometimes with the people we work closest with, we somehow feel free to manifest the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. And I think that's why so often people cite hypocrisy in the home of pastors. They're one way in the pulpit, they're one way around church people, they're a different way around their spouse and kids. And we see the damage of that type of hypocrisy. Now, I'm not in any way calling for perfection. None of us perfectly display the fruit of the Spirit all the time. Some of us struggle in one area and not the other in terms of fruit of the Spirit. But in general, this idea that David went home to bless his household is an important principle in terms of how should we think like a leader. Think in terms of going home to be a blessing. I can remember many years ago when I would come from my office to home when I had teenage sons, early teens. I lived in a part of Manila where our office and our training center was just a few kilometers from my home, so it was a quick ride. Other times it would be an hour, hour and a half, depending on where the office was and where we lived, but this was a short one. And I can remember times when I would come home and I knew I still had the weight of the world figuratively on my shoulders, and I knew that my sons, what they would want from me when I got home and all the talk and all the what was going on that day, and my wife. And there were times when I would circle the outer road of our neighborhood, sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes 4 or 5 times, praying in the Spirit and getting really my soul in a place where I could do what David did, what the Scripture says, so where I could go home and be a blessing to my household and not walk in exhausted, where I have poured out everything for everyone else, whether it's calls from people around the world or the people we were ministering to or new believers or people almost believers and all the things that I did, and then come home and that angry, drained, grumpy, cranky, disattached, distant person. So you want to think like a leader. Whatever level of leadership you are, whatever it is you lead, leadership is not just your performance out there in the moment. To think like a leader, think like this passage in 1 Chronicles 16:43. David went home to bless his household. I pray God would give me and every one of you the grace to be a blessing at home, not just in ministry.